All right, let's get right into it. When we talk about reconciliation, especially for businesses, it's really tempting to just jump into the what do we do now? But, doing that without understanding the history is like trying to build a house on sand. So in this explainer, we're going to build that foundation. We're going to look at the historical context that really shapes everything today.
This quote right here, it perfectly captures what we're doing. This isn't just about revisiting the past for the sake of it. It's about getting on the same page. Because every legal framework, every call to action, it all grows directly from this history. So let's start at the beginning.
So how do we get here? Well, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and what would become Canada didn't just happen by accident. No, it was very deliberately built over hundreds of years through specific legal ideas and government policies. And if you want to understand the present, you have to understand those.
And believe it or not, we have to go way, way back to the 15th century to find the starting point. It's called the doctrine of discovery. This was an international idea used by European explorers and their countries, and it basically said, hey, if the people living on this land aren't Christian, we can claim it as ours. It's that simple. This became the very first legal argument for dispossession, and really, it's the bedrock for everything that came after.
Okay, now let's jump forward to 1763, the Royal Proclamation. This is a really complex one. On one hand, it was a huge deal. Why? Because it was the first time the British Crown officially recognized that Indigenous peoples actually held title to their lands. But, and this is a big but, it also said that only the Crown could negotiate for that land. So at the exact same time, it acknowledged rights while also centralizing all the power, and that set the stage for the entire treaty process.
Now, if we're talking about control, we have to talk about the Indian Act of 1876. This thing was a tool of massive, sweeping control. It imposed a new form of governance, it legally defined who was and who wasn't an Indian according to the government, it put a stranglehold on economic independence, and it did all of this with one ultimate goal in mind: assimilation.
And that goal of assimilation, well, it led to one of the most painful and traumatic parts of Canadian history: the residential school system. The purpose was stated very clearly: to kill the Indian in the child. This wasn't about education. This was a system designed for cultural genocide. The abuse, the loss of language, the disconnection from family, it created this deep intergenerational trauma that continues to create very real economic and social barriers for people right now, today.
And these policies didn't just end with the last residential school. Starting in the 1950s, something called the 60 Scoop began. It was, in many ways, the same idea, but with a different method. This time, the child welfare system was used to remove thousands of Indigenous kids from their homes, placing them with non-Indigenous families. Again, this just shattered more families, more communities, and more cultural connections.
Okay, so we've looked at this legacy of control and assimilation. Now let's pivot. Let's talk about the very documents that were meant to define a relationship of partnership, the treaties. How you see these documents is absolutely fundamental to understanding the modern landscape of Indigenous rights.
This slide right here, this gets to the heart of so much of the conflict. Just look at the two perspectives. On one side, you have the Crown, which saw the treaties as basically a real estate transaction, a one-time deal to surrender land. But from the First Nations perspective, no way. These were sacred nation-to-nation agreements to share the land and resources forever, in peace. We're talking about two completely different worldviews here, and that gap in understanding is still a massive issue.
So, how do we even begin to bridge a gap that wide? Well, the modern framework for doing that really starts with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Its first job was to document the truth of what happened in residential schools. Out of that truth came the 94 calls to action, basically a roadmap for all of us. And for anyone in the corporate world, Call to Action 92 is the one that speaks directly to you, giving the business community a very specific job to do.
Now, along with the TRC, there's another total game changer, UNDRIP. That stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is key. It's now part of Canadian law. What it does is shift the standard for engagement. The old way was a duty to consult, but the new standard is free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. And that's a world of difference. It means Indigenous peoples don't just get to be consulted, they have the right to give or withhold their consent on projects that affect them. For business, this changes everything.
So let's put it all together. Here's the bottom line for the corporate world. The colonial policies we talked about, they created the systemic barriers we see today. The treaties? They're seen as living economic agreements, not old history. The TRC gives businesses a clear mandate to get involved, and UNDPR sets the new legal and ethical standard for how to get involved, and that standard is free, prior, and informed consent.
Everything we've covered, the doctrines, the laws, the trauma, and the modern calls for justice, all of it, that's the foundation. It's the essential context. It's the why. So the question for all of us, and especially for business, isn't if we should act anymore, it's how. Now that we understand the foundation, how are we going to build on it?